you didn't really know people very well because the crews constantly were switching out. You'd be with one set of boats, maybe two or three one day, and then the next day for a mission, you'd have another set of boats. And so you really didn't get to know the crews very well. I mean, it was kind of a different situation. You may go in the rivers with, three, four, five boats, and then the next day, very different set of crews. Our crew was different to the extent that we were together most of the year. We were fortunate in that, aside from shrapnel wounds and that kind of thing, we didn't lose anybody on our crew, which was actually
Wow.
remarkable. The casualty rate on the boats was 75%. So you had a 75% chance of either being killed or wounded on the boats. And from my experience, that's pretty much the
Wow.
case. They were aluminum boats, and of course, they were firing rockets and you know machine guns and shells, and so it tended to splinter. And that's most of the wounds were shrapnel, unless you got hit directly.
A couple times when I've been down in the Delta, and you're on these big rivers, and then you get into these canals that you describe, and you describe these canals that are extremely narrow. And as I'm on these boats, I mean, I had this thought both times, and this is just the person who knows nothing about combat in the Mekong Delta, but as I'm going down these canals and the thick brush, along these canals, and I'm thinking, I have two thoughts. One is that any 15-year-old down here can be an enemy,
Right.
and any one of those 15-year-olds can be hiding behind any bit of these plants, these bushes and trees that are absolutely thick all along this canal. And if that's the case, then there's no way we can win this war. Right now, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
Well, it
just that
does.
sense of as I'm going down the canal, I'm just thinking, how in the world can you defend yourself when you can't even see, 6 inches past the shoreline because the shrubbery is so thick?
Well, you just basically nailed the problem. They were able to secure themselves in bunkers. They had, I mean, they were shooting behind fortifications, basically and pretty much impervious to us. And I mean, we were well armed. We had twin 50 caliber machine guns in the gun tub. I had an M60 up front, which was in the bow where I was, and we had a 50 caliber over and under 81 millimeter mortar on the back. So we were well armed, but it was very close in. So the only thing you could do is get their head down and get out of there. There was really not much else you could do. You're not going to defeat them. The choice was to get through as quickly as you could, because we're on a mission of some sort. Or we could maybe identify where they were, and we could call in sea wolves, the helicopters or something, to do more damage than we could. And we did get out occasionally. I mean, we actually got off the boats and did sweeps to see if we could identify where spider holes were, where they might be shooting from. And so, it was kind of a combination of that. But basically, you're a sitting duck. You're sitting on an aluminum boat, and you're right off the shoreline, and they're well entrenched, and it's all up to them when they want to hit you. So, and they were very clever. I mean, they were ruthless, and no question about it. The war was unwinnable the way we were fighting it. There's no question about it.
Let me ask you, I mean, just not thinking about the big war, because this is my assumption, tell me if I'm wrong, but I've talked to enough vets who, for them, the war was just what was immediately around them. That's the war. You're down in Four Corps, you don't know what's going on in I Corps. You might know later as you read books and so on. But, in this world you're in, your swift boat, other boats you may be operating with, you're going up these canals, um, getting ambushed, it sounds like constantly, these quick, instant, fights. As you look back on just the world you operated in, what do you think might have been more successful as strategy, or was it just kind of an impossible situation no matter what?
I'm not sure what you could have done, honestly. The restriction on, I mean, you had to stop material coming down first. I mean, you
From the
had to
Ho Chi
stop.
Minh and then Ho
Right,
Chi Minh Trail
exactly.
and down to the rivers.
And just a sidelight, the Navy is actually what caused the Ho Chi Minh Trail because they used to bring their supplies down by sea. It was much easier. They just bring it down the coast and they were able to infiltrate all their supplies that way. Much easier for them. And the Navy, with market time, Operation Market Time, shut that off between the Coast Guard farther out and the Navy inshore units, the swift boats, uh, and some of the smaller craft. They just shut that off. So the North Vietnamese had no choice but to create the Ho Chi Minh Trail to get the material down into the Delta and into South Vietnam. So that strategy was very, very successful, but we could never shut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was just not possible.
That gets to a theme that I want to ask about in a minute, but I'm always interested in the experience of the individual. Um, you can put yourself in your mind back on that swift boat in one of these very narrow canals, and I'm wondering, you know, sort of what your physical, psychological state was when you're in that canal, and I'm wondering is when you get out of that canal and then onto one of the bigger rivers. Was it almost like a sigh of relief because you've gotten out of this constricted, you know, almost
Yeah,
death trap kind of environment?
the rivers were wide enough that your chances were much better of not having a problem. So yes, that was it was safer and kind of a break for us. The problem was we were on a one day at a time. You patrolled every day basically. There were no such thing as a 5 day work week or something like that. And we were constantly on call because part of our job was to support troops, and the South Vietnamese Navy and villagers, and we didn't just go fight. One of the things we did, we would take dentists in, for example, to these back villages. American dentists would go in, and we'd take them back there, and they would work all day on, helping these people with their dental work, which they needed badly. We also would go in and we would go into these areas, these remote areas, and take doctors in, take Navy doctors in and corpsmen. And that the same purpose, to help them to try and give them some level of medical care because they didn't have any, they had nothing. And we go in and take them food and whatever, trying sanitation, to help them. So we weren't over there just to fight. I mean, we were there to try and help these poor people.
Did this contribute at all to a feeling of frustration? I'm wondering. So, all right, so today's mission, we're bringing a dentist, we're bringing a doctor in, we're going to do some hearts and minds stuff. So we're going to bring them into the village. And so there they are, they're helping folks in the village. And 3 days later, around the same area, we get hit.
Mm,
And the people in the village, it's impossible that they didn't know.
yeah.
And I mean, is that now I'm just making all that up, but did I mean, was that kind of part of the situation on the ground? We're doing hearts and minds, but we're still getting shot at on almost a daily basis.
Well, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were intimidating villagers. I mean, they were, I mean, if anything, they co-opted them, to go fight, but they didn't want anything to do with it. They wanted to live their peaceful existence. They were fishermen. They were trying to raise families. They do what every family in the world is trying to do. So no, I just felt terrible for them because they, I mean, we're in there trying to help them. The Viet Cong, the VC, or the North Vietnamese army, they're there intimidating them, taking their young away to fight. you know, making them give up food, give up information if they know we're in the area. But they didn't have any choice. You know, it's not like they were collaborating with the enemy. And to my mind, in any sense of the word, they were just in a terrible situation. There was nothing they could do about it.
So far as I pick up from what you've written, most of the firefights, maybe all of them, are extremely brief. So the swift boats going up, usually a canal. I mean, I think there's one instance I remember where you guys actually get to shoot first, otherwise they always get to shoot first.
Right.
And so, I mean, what would be, if there is such a thing as kind of a typical firefight, so that at the end of the day you say, oh, well, we just had another sort of run-of-the-mill firefight today. What would that be like? How would that
Well,
unfold?
you let's say you're going up a small canal, and you know, I've got my M60 on the bow pointing off one side because you don't know which side it's going to come from. So the M60 would be pointed off the starboard side, let's say. Twin 50s would be pointed off the port side. Well, then you'd want the aft 50 caliber pointed off to the starboard side. So you had, you know, you were covered on both banks. And then when the firefight started, everybody, of course, switched, you know, to get over to the side we were taking fire from. And so, you know, the 50s were, they were pretty intimidating, twin 50s. So it was better if, you know, if it came from that side. But uh, essentially, you're just riding along, stressed, you know, tense, waiting, and you never saw it coming. They just opened up on you. And of course, if you're three or four boats, you know, the first boat got through okay, the second one not so good, the third one not too good, and the fourth one maybe got really badly hit. But the idea was to get through as quickly as you could, because usually you had another mission in mind, and they were just shooting up the boats. That's all they cared about. And sometimes we turned into it, you know, we would swing into the bank and destroy the bunker, but that was pretty rare because we just didn't have you know, the firepower to really stop them. So, and sometimes we went out and did sweeps. We take fire one day, you know, we'll go back the next day, and then we'll get off the boats and do sweeps and see if we can figure out, maybe blow the bunkers up if they were using those. Because
So
they never, they were never in the same place
so
twice.
you Navy guys on the swift boats would actually get off the boats
Oh,
and
yeah.
do that yourselves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We'd sweep because we had, you know, Vietnamese. We didn't have any American troops down there. It was all strictly South Vietnamese troops. And a lot of we did troop transport quite a bit. In other words, we would take North Vietnamese troops or South Vietnamese troops in, and we would insert them, and then we'd wait there, you know, till they got back, and then we'd pick them up and take them out. So that was a big part of it. So we'd have them stacked all over the boat, you know,
Mm.
which was very dangerous for them and kind of for us because they were really in the way if we took fire. That was one. And then the other thing we did a lot was insert seals into the area. We'd take them up as far as we could get them up these canals. And then the seals would go and they'd take off and do their mission. And then we'd come back. A lot of times they came back hot and we came back under fire to get them out of there. But, and they did a great job. They're just amazing, amazing
Well,
special.
I want to ask you about both of these then. So this sounds to me like then part of the Vietnamization process, because it's you guys, but it's all South Vietnamese forces. You're not inserting American forces, you're inserting
Not
South
where we
Vietnamese
were.
forces
No, it was mostly South Vietnamese with American advisors.
with advisors. So what was your assessment of the South Vietnamese forces, generally speaking? Were you confident that they'd be able to
No,
stand on their own?
they weren't very effective, honestly, compared to America. They weren't as well trained. They weren't as committed, I mean, they were conscripts basically. And they just weren't a very effective fighting force, not through no fault of their own. They just, it just wasn't, it wasn't an effective force because of training.
How could you just tell that by how they carried themselves, by the looks in their faces, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you could, I mean, they were, of course, they were scared, obviously,
Sure.
but I don't think they were very well led either, other than by the American, there was a lot of politics involved in who ran the troops,
Mm.
and they never had effective leadership uh, at the top. Their political leadership was corrupt and not very good.
So when you left then, just as a thought exercise, when you fly out in it's early 70, right? When you fly
Yeah,
out.
fair
When
right
you
for February.
so when you fly out in early 70, suppose the guy next to you asks, so do you think the South Vietnamese will be able to hold this on their own once we're out of there completely? What do you think you would have said?
I just said no.
They're not
I
gonna be able
don't
to
think
do it.
there's any way. I don't understand really the difference. I don't know if it was intimidation or commitment, but the North Vietnamese, the NVA were a more effective fighting force, than the South Vietnamese army. And the Viet Cong were, of course, guerrilla warfare. And that's the other thing. We were kind of trying to fight with a World War II strategy. And it was a guerrilla war. It was not going to be won on a battlefield or, you know, uh, with posts. And it was a guerrilla war. And would have had better chances to win with SEALs and special forces and go after their leadership. But that's not the way that we fought the war. We're still fighting on World War II tactics.
So you mentioned that the NVA were, more disciplined soldiers than the South Vietnamese. So you've kind of answered this question already, but now and you are fighting. I don't gather that you actually see the enemy very much. You're fighting
Rarely,
at tracers and
right?
things
You're
like.
seeing incoming fire, rarely.
So do you know, were you primarily against NVA, primarily against Viet Cong, 50-50 mix?
Well, I think you could tell the NVA, they were much more effective, more of them. They, more effective fire. Viet Cong they were more, hit the base with mortars, plant mines, in the water. They were more a guerrilla force. The NVA was more of an organized army, and we'd rather face the VC than the NVA.
Now, you're dealing with NVA? I mean, you're way down for part of your service. You're way down at the very southern tip of South Vietnam, right?
Right, right.
And you're dealing with NVA down there?
Mhm. Yes.
I mean, it almost seems surreal that because you think about what does it take to get NVA forces from North Vietnam all the way down to the southern tip of South Vietnam, and they're still an effective fighting force.
Well, the other thing to remember is Laos and Cambodia, because they were sanctuaries for them. I mean, the Laotians and the Cambodians had no control over and so they could actually funnel all the troops down without even having to get into Vietnam, and then they could come over from Cambodia and Laos, and so it was pretty easy to get NVA troops down there. One of the most dangerous runs we had was there's a place called Ha Tien and the Binte Canal and what we call Bernique's Creek, which is Mike Bernique was the first guy to go into this canal and open it up and actually change the strategy that Zumwalt saw that we needed to go from market time to sea lords to actually insert our Navy in there. Would never have a chance to win the war. But that was one of our most dangerous runs because, the Cambodia and Laos were full of North Vietnamese troops. And they didn't have any trouble getting down there. it was very easy for them to do.
Well, now at this time, I know the Cambodian incursion is coming, but at this time when you were there, were you restricted from going into Cambodia?
We were theoretically restricted from even firing into Cambodia. Theoretically, we didn't pay any attention to that because if you're taking fire, you shoot back. But yeah, it was like a sanctuary for the enemy. You couldn't send troops over there. You couldn't send helicopters over. It was, another sort of failed strategy from the war that, they shouldn't have been that way.
In your memoir, I picked up on a paradox where you know, you mention different things and then you put them together and there's this paradox at place. And you mentioned it in one instance, the boat goes by a place, I forget the details, but you've got an NVA flag there flying in the Delta, 4 Corps, I'm assuming. NVA flag. Um, you have, you mentioned that the Viet Cong could hit with impunity. And then you say that we won every engagement. And, so that tells me that we're looking at a pretty complicated situation because we're winning every engagement,
Right,
and yet the NVA have their flag flying in the Mekong, and
right.
the VC can hit us anytime they want.
Yeah.
So having been there, how do you kind of unravel
There's
this
a
plot of
paradox.
how these things can be true at the same time?
Well, it's because we were fighting just individual firefights, in a small location, and they would, fight us, and they were trying to demoralize us, obviously, because we never knew when it was going to come. But uh, they were in charge, basically. They could pick the time, the place, uh, and they could disperse into the countryside, and we had no way to get them. Even if we called in helicopters, a lot of times they were gone by the time they got there. We rarely had helicopter support. There just weren't enough of them there. But they pretty much had it to themselves. Once they disappeared into the interior, we had no way to go after them. So,
And it sounds like they got to choose, even though they go into these engagements knowing that they're going to lose, they get to choose when the engagements happen,
right, right.
which still implies kind of a winning hand. If you always get to choose when the fight takes place, in some sense at least, you have the upper hand.
Well, we were constantly rotating troops in and out, and we just didn't have any permanent strategy to win there. And I think they and I'm not sure what the answer was. If you've been to the Delta, you know what it's like. It's just mangrove swamps and canals, and it's just a mess in there. And so they pretty much had the run of it. The only time we had control is when we were in that particular canal at that time, or that particular river. And we spent a lot of time searching junks. And poor fishermen, they're trying to earn a living, and we're looking around for contraband. But it was just a mess. I mean, there's no way. I mean, you take Cambodia, Laos as sanctuaries for them, and then you take this mangrove swamp where they can go anywhere they want. They can pick the time of the fight and the duration of it, and then they can leave. And we tried to go out sometimes, but I mean, you got 5 guys, 6 guys on a swift boat. You're not gonna do much in terms of tracking them back into the. We weren't supposed to do that anyway. We weren't supposed to be off those boats. And the South Vietnamese were not a very effective fighting force. I mean, a lot of times we take them, and it's not to disparage, because they certainly had their share of combat, but a lot of times we drop them off and they'd just get out of sight and they'd stop. They wouldn't go any farther, and they'd just wait till we picked them up again. And that wasn't that uncommon. So And that's leadership. That has nothing to do with the average,
Yeah.
South Vietnamese soldier. They just weren't well led. So
Did you say a minute ago? So several minutes ago, you said you sometimes you guys would get off the boats and destroy bunkers and things. But in doing that, were you breaking the rules? Your
basically,
orders were stay on the boat, but sometimes
yeah,
you guys would say no.
right, yeah,
You've got something to take care of. We're going to get off the boat.
right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things they used were, we call them spider holes, where they were just, you know, the earth. They dig out the earth and they put up some camouflage in the front, sticks and bushes, and then they'd fire from those. Well, if you're trying to figure out where the fire's coming from, you almost can't do it. So we would sometimes just go out and sweep those fields and, destroy those spider
Yeah.
holes,
I
so.
you'd leave one or two guys on the boat just to defense the boat, and then the other guys would go out. Once again, in your mind, you can put yourself back on these in these canals, and you can see the seals there. On the swift boats, these seals that you're inserting, you're picking up. What are the images you have in your mind, the thoughts you have in your mind when you think about these seals that you're inserting and picking up?
Deep admiration. I mean, those guys were something. We didn't get to know them really, but we had just immense admiration for them because, once we let them off the boat, they were on their own out there in the enemy territory. But we didn't get to know them. I mean, we pick them up, they just hunker down on the engine covers in the back. And I mean, it was serious. We were taking them in to enemy territory. So I don't think they particularly like being on the boat, because you're kind of a sitting duck going to get to where they were going. They were more familiar with missions where they're out in the ground. But I mean, they were something. And they come back, and we never knew what they were doing in there, but they were right in the heart of enemy held territory. So
Would they be in groups of 4 or 5 usually?
usually, yeah.
And did you have I've talked to helicopter pilots who will insert and pick up LRPs, these long range reconnaissance guys, and they say that sometimes they're picking them up when they're actually running and they've got NVA behind them, shooting, they're under fire. Same thing.
We did the same thing with the SEALs a lot of times. I mean, when they called, excuse me, when they called, we went to get them. That was just it. And a lot of times they did come out where they were under fire, and so we collect them and get them out of there, and no matter where they were.
So you didn't really have interaction with the SEALs. The SEALs didn't talk to you guys.
Not really, not really. No, they were they're really focused. I mean, really focused on their mission and their discipline. And we felt it was our job to get them there safely and get them out of there safely. So uh,
And how long would they be out typically on their own?
a day to 4 or 5 days. It just depended on the mission, how far they had to go. I mean, they were in, I think they sometimes assassinated, Viet Cong or NVA that were in villages, reconnaissance, to find out where they were and what their movements and all of that. I'm not really sure, to be honest with you.
Sure.
But they, we never talked, and they didn't berth with us. Everything was separate, but they were a really closely knit, tight group, and highly disciplined, and that's just what they did.
You went into the Navy, was it 65 when you enlisted?
66. I went in 66. Yeah.
So 66 when you enlisted. And was part of your thinking, because you mentioned the draft, and when we think of the draft, and that means Army, most of the time anyway.
Mm.
So were you thinking, well, the only way I can avoid the draft is to enlist, and if I go Navy, then it's unlikely that I'll see combat. Was that part of your
That's probably
process?
part of it. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just didn't I really didn't want to fight in the ground war, I guess you could say. But as I was in the Navy longer, that attitude of I don't want to be in it changed to I do want to
Yeah.
be in it. So
If you just isolate that time aboard the Ticonderoga, and let's say that that was it, that you stayed there doing that work, and it's necessary work, right? The aircraft carriers play an important role, and the radarmen play an important role aboard the carrier. So let's say that that is your service. What would your perspective of the Vietnam War be just from that perspective, from that point of view? What did the Vietnam War look like to you from that job aboard the aircraft carrier?
sort of remote, really. I mean, you're not really involved in it other than tracking planes going over, talking to, see some of them come shot up, have been shot up, and, you've got the resting, deal where you can, I mean, so you can catch them because they don't have landing gear and that kind of, so you see the results of combat, but you're not really involved in it. I think if that had been my sole uh, service, I'd have been just as proud of that as I am, all of it. He was, as I say, we went through Swift school together, and we were at the same, uh, in the same Antoy, same location. We were, pretty good friends, and he was, some people kind of get caught up in the war, and they just almost can't get enough of it.
Hmm.
And he volunteered for another mission that was not on the boats. He was actually, I think, at Vietnamese junk or something like that. And he was killed that way on the boat. So it was actually an extra mission that he was on. And some of the guys, like the 43 boat, for example, they lost four of their guys on their boat. But we were fortunate that didn't happen to us. So Whistler just strike. He just is a particular one I remember.
There was the one instance where you had the two guys who were hit on the fantail
Mhm.
of the Swift boat. Are you willing to just kind of walk us through that?
Well, it was, I could see it play out in front of me. I mean, they're actually kind of talking. They're both at the pedestal there at the end, and I could see out of the corner of my eye the rocket coming. Nothing could do about it, and then they were hit, and uh, started returning fire. Their boat returned fire, and we got back, and the crew was devastated. Their crew was devastated. So we got them off and got them, some help, and then we took it on ourselves to clean the boat up. That's what we did when we got back to the base, and I'm sure those guys are never the same, any of them.
So what is the process? Because so you see this happen, you see these guys get hit by this incoming round, and then you participate in cleaning out the boat. Um, but I'm assuming the next day there's probably another mission.
It's
So
exactly right. It just you just move right on to the next day, and you don't really process it, you know, then you can't. You have to get on with, our jobs.
so you just put it away. Um,
You,
is
you
it
have to you have to compartmentalize if you're a combat veteran and you go through things like that, or even just the trauma of it. It's like a book. You can take it out, you can open it up, you can read the chapter, or you can read the page and then close it and put it away. And you know, that's essentially what you have to do. You don't ever really get over it. But on the other hand, I didn't dwell on it.
don't have the time and the mental energy to process this stuff at the time, is it then that you process it after the war, or is it that after the war you just say, well, that was the war, and so I mean, you just let it go? How does it work out with you?
Well, I think everybody does things differently. When I got back to the States, I knew, that I was mentally in kind of a state of, still hyper, you get under a real hyper stress deal. And so I decided my way to cope with that is I just dropped off the planet for, for 30 days. And I stayed in Southern California and I visited friends that were on the aircraft carrier and nobody knew where I was. My parents didn't know where I was. My future wife didn't know where I was. I just disappeared for 30 days. And everybody was pretty concerned about me, I'm sure, but that was my decompression time I took. And I spent it with other veterans that weren't the combat veterans, but kind of got me back. Some of them were married and so I kind of got to see real life again, and I really got to decompress.
If I understand right, you had this experience of you're in Vietnam, you arrive back in the States, and pretty much immediately you're a civilian again.
Right. Oh, it was just instant. I walked into San Francisco, or I flew into San Francisco, and for those that don't think the protesters were spitting on American soldiers when they came back, it's not true. They were. I mean, they were at the gates and outside the fence yelling, and it was awful. So that was my entry back to the United States, was the anti-war movement. But I had requested to be discharged in San Diego, so I flew because I had relatives in La Jolla, and so that was kind of a little bit of a help too. But I flew back to San Francisco, got out of my uniform as soon as I could because of the climate, the anti-war climate in the area. And then I flew to San Diego, which is where I requested to be discharged, and I was. And then from there, when I was done with my sabbatical, I flew back to Billings and moved to Missoula. So yeah, that was it.
The life course that is most common, at least what I've heard the most from veterans, is they come back from the war. Um, they feel either hostility or indifference or both. And so you've expressed that, you arrive in San Francisco and there are the protesters right there. You have this, I mean, hard to believe experience, but I've heard it so many times. You're in Vietnam, you arrive back in the States, and you're immediately a civilian again. No sort of decompressing,
Mm.
out processing periods. You're a civilian again. So they a number have that, and then there's that sense of I don't know if alienation is the right word, but knowing that there's fighting still going on in Vietnam, knowing what that's like, and then there you are in the grocery store, the bank, the college classroom, just feeling like, I mean, it's almost surreal. Like, how can this be happening while that's still going on in Vietnam? But they don't talk about it, except maybe with other combat vets they know. They don't they don't volunteer to other folks that they're Vietnam vets. They stay quiet about it for a long time. And then we get to retirement age, and then they begin to think about it more. And that time in their life, they're finding themselves talking about it more, thinking about it more. Does that general story basically fit
It's
how?
essentially true. I'll tell you a story about Vietnam vets. When I came back, took the uniform off, and never talked about it again. I mean, that was it. I became a civilian. I went to school, went into banking, and essentially never talked about it. And then in 1988, which is 18 years after I got back from the war, we built a memorial to Vietnam vets in what's originally was a veteran park for World War II veterans. So we built this memorial. It's beautiful. And it has all the names of the Montana people killed in Vietnam on plaques around it. And uh, so we, you know, I was one of the founding members of the thing. And so we get a group together to try and figure out how to build this thing because it costs money, obviously. And so we all get together in this room, and I'm astounded. People I've known for 18 years were Vietnam vets. I mean, it was just never talked about in there. We're looking like, well, I didn't know you were in Vietnam. And, I didn't know you were in Vietnam.
You said that in your case, you haven't, felt this kind of very difficult. You haven't had a very difficult struggle with PTSD and that kind of thing. I wonder if, though, still in some way, being a combat veteran, if it if there is inevitably sort of a chasm, I don't know if that's the right word, a separation, a distance, between the combat vet and everyone else.
Mm.
And you come home from the war, you get on with your life, you have your career, but you have this experience of combat that's very rare, that's extremely intense, that I mean, except for maybe a police officer in a certain case, can't be replicated in the civilian world. Um, does that experience, I mean, does it inevitably kind of create a little gap between you and the rest of American society, do you feel?
Well, probably. I mean, it's the if you look at statistically, it takes about nine support people to for every warrior that's actually out there in the field. I mean, it's just logistically, there's a lot to it. So in terms of, I mean, we're relatively unique in the world. It's a VC or an NVA graveyard, an enemy graveyard. So they actually buried, they didn't haul them back. They buried them in the Delta when after firefight. So we just happened to come on that one of the remote canals that we uh, were on. So I just took a picture of it. We didn't desecrate it in any sense of the word. But feel we should. But they didn't have any method to take these. Their casualties were high. I mean, we were a pretty effective fighting force, so they had high casualties. And so I just thought it was kind of an interesting moment where you actually could see where they had set up a graveyard. Just an example of what happens to those things when they get hit. I mean, it was a rocket hit to the aft part of the boat, and it explodes inward. And the depending on where it hits, if that particular hit was good because the shrapnel exploded into the middle part of the boat, or the the interior of the boat. The danger was we had a below the deck in the cabin, what we called the cabin, which had a sleeping bunk, about it, and a kind of a little area where you could eat sea rats, and cook. Below that, there was the magazine where we kept all our ammunition. And so if that happened to get hit, the whole boat would go up. And the same way with that we kept our mortars on the after mortar box at the very stern of the boat. If that ever got hit, they'd go up in a blaze of glory. So there were some other dangerous elements, particularly with the rockets. If they hit, it was pretty much a disaster for the boats. That's the 43 boat. They were hit with rockets, and they beached, and and the the basically were attacked, and the boat was essentially destroyed. And I think they lost 3 or 4 on that day. That may have been the most devastating event for a crew where you lose 4 out of 5 or 6. That
Is this destruction I'm looking at, was this the result of what the Viet Cong or the NVA did, or was it that plus US forces going in later and then just completely destroying it to make sure nothing could be taken from it?
well, a combination of the two.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It was, they beached the boat because they'd been hit and they'd lost steering. So they beached the boat and they got behind it to, you know, to fight. And, but the boat was largely destroyed then. But yes, and it was not usable. So then it was further destroyed by Americans. One of the real anxieties of combat when you first get there is, are you able to do it? You know, can you handle fighting? I mean, what if you didn't? And we experienced guys that froze up; they just couldn't do it. And we had one guy had to pry his hands off the twin fifties. He just froze up, and he'd been there for a while, you know. So I think one of the key points is stresses is, are you going to be able to handle this not only the first time, which is the most, you know, that's the start, but can you do it for an entire year? And so I think that's another part of the anxiety of, you know, of combat. Can you do
Yeah, you mentioned there's one story, right, where the question was, if I remember correctly, why didn't that 50 fire? And someone asked you to go check to
it?
see if
Yeah.
something was wrong with it, and it turns out the 50 was fine, just the guy never shot because he just froze up.
And he was removed from the boats. Um, we had one of our guys, one severely wounded uh, South Vietnamese soldier was lifted aboard the boat next to us, and the guy was extreme heat. He was stressed in the twin fifties, and he passed out and hit the firing bar on the fifties, and it fired into the boat next door. And those things happen in combat. Fortunately, he was hurt, and you know, he recovered and went on to serve the rest of his term with us, his time. But those things happen. You know, it's you've got people under extreme stress, and everybody reacts differently every day. And some days you know you can handle it better, and some days you're just terrified. You know, but you have to give, you know, the people who go through it credit because they did get through it, and you know the ones that couldn't handle it. I'm not critical. I mean, you know, I don't know what is the marker for makes somebody can do it and some can't. But you know, I was never critical if somebody just couldn't do it anymore, and all you had to do was say, I'm done. You know, I don't want to.
Did you, I talked to a soldier who was in 3 Corps and just saw a lot of combat. And at one point, I guess his sergeant just basically said, "You're done. I mean, we're going to get you out of here," because it was clear that he was going to snap and do something crazy because he had just come to the end of his rope. Do you recollect ever having that feeling? I mean, you guys are getting hit so often. Um, did you remember ever having that thought, like, how much more of this can I take before I just can't do this anymore?
Well, you know, you just don't want to let down your crew, you know, your guys. You want to. I mean, we had one swift guy that figured out a way to get out early. I won't talk about that, but you know, and abandon his crew. But most of the uh, most of us wouldn't leave because we would feel it would be a betrayal of the people we served with. So no, I was never any thought of uh, you know, trying to leave early. I don't think. I think it would just not be. It would be looked at as we let our crew down. You know, we're all essential. I had a severe fungal infection, skin basically called it jungle rot when I was over there, and because it was humid and unsanitary, and you know, I just my skin just reacted. I had terrible, it was red, and there I still suffer from it today. But the corpsman wanted to send me out, and you know, so you got to get out of here. This is going to get worse and worse. I said I won't go. I'm not going to do it. So you know,
And
that's just
that's not about a commitment to fighting communism. That's not about Yankee Doodle.
no. It's your guys.
That's about the sailors I'm with.
Yeah. Oh, fighting, that was the farthest thought from our mind, was God and country, fighting communists, any of that stuff. It was survival and not letting your fellow crew members down.